Helin. I'm President and Chairman of Eagle Spirit Energy, and I'm from Lax Kw'alaams BC. You know, I think it's been assumed that First Nations and environmental interests have always gone together, but what the chiefs are starting to see a lot now is that there is a lot of very underhanded tactics, and where certain people are paid in communities and they're used as the spokesperson, essentially puppets and props for environmental groups to kill resource development. And the really sad thing is that our most important commodity, oil and energy, is being controlled by Americans. It's outrageous. People should be upset about that. We thought, or a lot of people, Indigenous people thought that when they voted for Trudeau for Prime Minister of the Liberal Party, that's what they thought they were doing, not voting for Jerry Butts to be the Prime Minister. I mean, the environmental agenda is trumping everybody's rights, and they have no legal standing. They certainly don't have constitutional rights like Indigenous people do. So they're going to flex their muscle, and they're doing so because they need opportunities. 90% plus unemployment in most northern communities, and for Indigenous groups, always the number one issue is environment. But unlike an environmental group that makes all of its money by stopping everything, the leaders of Indigenous communities have to have holistic development. As long as the environment's taken care of, they then have to look at business opportunities, social welfare opportunities, employment, and all of those other things. And it's not as simple as an environmental decision to stop things. And the other thing that's really ticked everybody off is to have these tactics of exaggerating the impacts of projects and then flying in celebrities who know nothing about their territories to tell them what they're going to do in their traditional territory. In my case, our people have looked after our traditional territory for 13,000 years. Well, enough of that. We don't need any green college fund babies telling us what to do in our own territory. The people have been there for thousands of years. They've looked after the territory. But at the same time, we've also had to eke out a living, and that involved trade, that involved business, that involved all kinds of things. We can't afford to have a one-dimensional kind of approach to development that is characteristic of environmental NGOs. Eco-colonialism. Basically what that means is the environmental communities are acting and co-opting First Nations communities in the same way that colonial governments did, you know, on contact. And arguably for the same kinds of impacts. You know, it's a common tactic for these environmentalists to call First Nations leaders sellouts. The sellouts for doing what? For standing up to their community, for their community, for their rights, for the kinds of things that they were elected for. Just because they aren't practicing the zealotry of their recently converted in this whole environmental ideology type idea. Who can afford that? You know, they killed the seal industry for the Inuit, and for thousands of years that was a good way of culling the seal herds. And it provided the Inuit with a source of food, a source of clothing, and when they sold the furs for a small amount of cash for which they could buy their basic staples. And having Brigitte Bardot and all of these people fly in, I mean, what the hell did they know about any of their traditional territories? A lot of the money for the Canadian NGOs is coming from American NGOs who have specific plans or strategies of suppressing our natural resource development. Look at what's happening, for example, with the oil industry. Right now, the Americans have become the biggest producers of oil in the world, surpassing Saudi Arabia. I think they're up to 11 million barrels a day. We're still at 3. They're drilling everywhere, in all their oceans and all of their parks. Oh, why aren't their own environmentalists paying attention to what's happening in their own backyard? Why are they prepared to make a park in the backyards of ordinary Canadians? I mean, we need the revenue, we need the development, we need the investment. First Nations people need the opportunities. They need to create educational opportunities for their own people, sustainable jobs. And instead, what you hear from these environmental groups is, but there's the green industry. Well, where the hell is it? Where is it? If it's such a great thing, why aren't people employed? That's what it boils down to. And the chiefs are mad. They are mad because what these environmental groups they go into their territory, and they have techniques similar to the CIA and banana republics. They have destabilization techniques. They hire certain people who pretend to be chiefs and to speak for the community. It's all nonsense. And the leaders of our communities can speak for themselves, and they're asserting themselves now. That's why these kinds of actions are taking place. You know, if you look at, if you go to any Business 101 course, if all of your business is done with one client, like the Canadian oil business is now with the United States, they're in a position of putting you out of business. They completely control you. For First Nations, it's been, the economic dependency has been purposely created by the federal government, and so primarily their only source of revenue is government transfer payments. They want their own independence, and the only way to get their independence is to generate their own source revenue. Their own responsible development. I think a lot of this has been organized by NGOs, e-NGOs, and they have people on their payroll that are the professional protesters, and it hasn't occurred to, I think, a lot of the communities that this is harming them until they've seen the impacts of projects being stopped. My home community of Lax Kw'alaams, the community voted, I think something like 75% to support the PNW LNG project. That would have translated into $2 billion in benefits to the community over the lifetime. One of the community members who claims he's a hereditary chief and started creating all kinds of trouble was clearly financed by American environmental groups, and he's not a chief at all. He received notices from the real hereditary chiefs that requested him to cease and desist what he was doing and bringing other professional protesters from all over the place onto Lilu Island, and but he's on the payroll. He's not going to stop as long as he's getting paid, right?
Right.
My purpose, I write books, my purpose in doing this is to help. Originally I was sent away from my community when I was 11 years old by my grandmother and my dad with the purpose of helping Indigenous people to be able to have a better way of life. And as I started writing, I realized my life purpose is to help people, whoever they are, poor people, help themselves by providing them with the knowledge to do so. Ordinary Canadians should be outraged. Why are we giving away $50 million a day in of our money from our most valuable oil resource? China, I've been taking trade missions to China since 1994. And the Chinese now are recommissioning all of their coal-fired energy plants with LNG. And LNG is far cleaner than coal. They desperately want LNG from Canada. The environmentalists here are screaming loudly, "Oh my God, this is awful." It would put 44% less CO2 into the atmosphere if they were burning LNG. Meanwhile, where the strategy is coming from the Americans, they're shipping LNG out from, I think now 4 or 5 brand new pipelines and ports. And who's the idiot in this picture, right? I mean, we're the idiots. And you know, there is the only thing that I could see wrong with this is once we understand this, it's time to do something about it. And this kind of thing is definitely harming Indigenous communities, and the chiefs and the leaders are speaking out about it.
Right.
Eagle Spirit Energy started 5 years ago, and its initial aim was to look at whether First Nations across northern Alberta and BC would support a crude oil pipeline. We went out to the communities all along a possible route, talked to them. They said very clearly that they weren't opposed to pipelines, but the environmental model had to meet their standards. So we hired the top international experts on environmental model for the ocean and for a pipeline. We went back to them. We set up a chiefs council of over 30 chiefs all the way along the route. That's how they'll engage in the project. At the first project, they voted unanimously to support an energy corridor. So we're talking about a corridor that could host LNG pipelines, crude oil pipelines, electrical transmission lines, all of that kind of stuff. And it would be the most environmentally safe thing to do, keeping everything in one tight corridor.